I checked the GPS on my phone for the third time, even though Mark was driving and clearly knew where he was going. The blue dot showed we were less than 5 minutes from Danvers State Hospital, and my stomach had that familiar twist of anticipation mixed with the kind of nerves that made me question why I'd agreed to this in the first place. Mark drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, making some noise I didn't recognize. He'd been in an unusually good mood since we left campus 2 hours ago, practically buzzing with excitement about this whole expedition. The idea had been his, of course. Mark always had ideas, and somehow he always managed to talk the rest of us into them. "You sure Jess and Sarah are still following us?" I asked, glancing in the side mirror. "Rick's driving them, right? They're fine." Mark took a left turn onto what looked like a back road. Besides, Sarah would have called if they got lost. You know how she gets. He wasn't wrong. Sarah had that way of quietly panicking about the smallest things, though she tried to hide it. When Mark first brought up the hospital idea last weekend, her face had gone through about 5 different expressions before settling on reluctant acceptance. Jess had been more direct about her concerns, asking practical questions about security and whether we'd actually get in trouble for trespassing. Rick, predictably, had been all for it before Mark even finished explaining the plan. The road curved through a stretch of trees that blocked out most of the afternoon light. When we emerged on the other side, I could see it in the distance, a massive brick complex sprawling across several acres, looking exactly like every abandoned mental hospital I'd ever seen in movies, except this one was real, and we were actually going inside. "There it is," Mark said, and I could hear the grin in his voice without looking at him. The building stood ahead of us, all dark red brick and broken windows. Even from a distance, I could see graffiti covering the lower sections of the walls, and what looked like plywood boards covering some of the larger openings. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, though it was clearly more symbolic than functional. I could already spot several gaps where the metal had been bent back or cut away entirely. Mark slowed down as we approached the parking area, which was really just a patch of cracked asphalt near the main entrance. Rick's car pulled up behind us a few seconds later, and I watched in the mirror as Jess and Sarah climbed out. Even from here, I could see Sarah looking up at the building with obvious second thoughts written all over her face. "Well," Mark said, shutting off the engine. "Ready for some exploring?" I got out of the car and immediately noticed how quiet everything was. No traffic sounds, no people. Just the occasional rustle of wind through the overgrown plants that had taken over most of the courtyard. The building looked even more imposing up close, with its rows of empty windows staring down at us like dead eyes. Rick jogged over from the other car, his usual energy on full display. "This place is perfect," he said, pulling out his phone to take pictures. "Look at all that graffiti. People have definitely been inside." Jess walked up more slowly, her arms crossed over her chest. "Maybe that's not exactly reassuring," she said. "We don't know who else might be in there." "It's Saturday afternoon," Mark pointed out. "Most urban explorers do this stuff at night for the spooky factor. We'll probably have the whole place to ourselves." Sarah finally joined us, but she stayed close to Jess and kept looking back toward the cars like she was figuring out how quickly she could get back to one if needed. "Are we sure about this?" she asked. "I mean, what if we get caught? What if there's security?" "What security?" Rick laughed, gesturing toward the building. "Look at this place. If they cared about keeping people out, they would have fixed the fence." He had a point. The chain-link barrier looked like it had been losing a battle with both time and determined trespassers for years. What had probably once been a secure perimeter was now more of a suggestion, with multiple obvious entry points where the metal had been bent back to create person-sized gaps. Mark was already walking toward the nearest opening, his hands in his jacket pockets. "Come on," he called back to us. "We drove all this way. Might as well take a look." I followed him through the gap in the fence, feeling the rough edges of the cut metal brush against my jacket. The others came behind me, Rick still taking pictures and making excited comments about how cool everything looked. Jess and Sarah brought up the rear, moving more carefully but still moving. The courtyard was bigger than it had looked from the parking area, filled with overgrown weeds and scattered debris. Old concrete walkways wound between sections of the building, cracked and broken in places where tree roots had pushed up from underneath. Someone had spray-painted "Stay Out" in large red letters on one of the walls, but the warning was almost completely covered by other graffiti layered on top of it. As we got closer to the main entrance, the scale of the place became more clear. The building wasn't just big, it was massive, stretching out in both directions with multiple wings and sections that disappeared around corners. Most of the windows on the ground floor had been boarded up, but the upper levels were just empty holes where glass used to be. "Look at the architecture," Mark said, tilting his head back to take in the full height of the structure. "They built these places to last. This thing has probably been here for over a century." "And it shows," Jess muttered, stepping carefully around a pile of broken concrete. The late afternoon sun was getting lower, casting long shadows across the courtyard that made the building look even more dramatic. I checked my phone. It was almost 4 o'clock, which meant we had maybe 2 hours of decent light left, if we wanted to explore and still make it back to the cars before dark. "Hey," Rick called from near what looked like a side entrance. "This door isn't locked." We all came together where he was standing. It was a heavy metal door, painted institutional green, but now faded and chipped. Rick had his hand on the handle, and when he pulled, the door swung open with a long, rusty creak that carried into the darkness beyond. A rush of cold air flowed out from inside, carrying a smell that was hard to identify, musty and stale, like a basement that had been closed up for decades. It wasn't exactly unpleasant, but it definitely wasn't welcoming either. Sarah took a step back. "Maybe we should just look around outside," she said. "I mean, we can see everything we need to see from out here, right?" "Are you kidding?" Rick was practically bouncing on his feet. "The interesting stuff is going to be inside. Patient rooms, medical equipment, maybe some old records or something." "Medical equipment that's been sitting here for years," Jess pointed out, "covered in who knows what kind of contamination." Mark looked at each of us in turn, and I could see him figuring out whether this was going to work, or if Sarah and Jess were going to bail on the whole thing. "We don't have to stay long," he said. "Just a quick look around. 15 minutes, maybe 20. Then we can head back if anyone's not comfortable." I found myself nodding before I'd really made a conscious decision. The truth was, I was curious too. All those stories Mark had told us about Danvers, the experimental treatments, the mysterious disappearances, the urban legends that had built up around the place over the years. None of us really believed any of it, but there was something interesting about finally seeing the reality behind all the rumors. "Fine," Sarah said, though she didn't sound convinced. "But we stick together and we leave if anything feels wrong." "Deal," Mark said and pushed the door open wider. The opening revealed a corridor that stretched away into complete darkness. The cold air continued flowing out around us, and I could hear what sounded like water dripping somewhere in the distance. Mark pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight, creating a narrow beam that lit up about 10 feet of hallway before disappearing into the shadows. "Last chance to change your mind," Jess said, but she was already digging her own phone out of her pocket. We stood there for a moment at the doorway. The 5 of us gathered around the open entrance like we were about to dive into deep water. The building waited silently ahead of us, dark and empty and full of possibilities we couldn't quite imagine yet. Then Mark stepped inside, his footsteps bouncing off the walls, and the rest of us followed him into the darkness. The cold air hit us immediately as we crossed the doorway, carrying that musty smell deeper into our lungs. Mark's phone light cut through the darkness ahead, revealing a corridor that stretched much farther than I'd expected. The beam picked up peeling paint hanging in long strips from the walls, and I could hear our footsteps bouncing off what sounded like a very high ceiling. My eyes adjusted enough to make out the basic shape of the hallway. Water damage had buckled the linoleum flooring in several places, creating uneven patches that made walking feel uncertain. When I stepped on a particularly warped section, it gave slightly under my weight, with a soft creaking sound that seemed much louder in the silence. "Watch where you're walking," Jess said behind me, her own phone light now adding to the illumination. "This floor is a mess." She was right. Broken glass covered the hallway in places, probably from light fixtures that had fallen over the years. I could see dark stains on the walls that could have been anything from water damage to graffiti to something I didn't want to think about too hard. Rust covered every visible piece of metal, door handles, pipe fittings, what looked like the remains of a drinking fountain mounted on one wall. Mark moved ahead with the kind of confidence that made it clear he was genuinely excited to be here. "Look at this place," he said, stopping to check out a doorway. "It's like walking through a time capsule." The doorway he'd stopped at had no door, just an empty opening leading into what appeared to be a small room. Rick moved up beside him and pointed his light inside, showing bare walls and a floor covered in debris. "Should we stick together?" Sarah asked. She'd been quiet since we entered the building, but I could hear the tension in her voice. "We could cover more ground if we split up," Mark said, already moving toward another doorway. "Just for like 30 minutes or something. Then we meet back up and compare notes." I wasn't excited about the idea of walking around alone in here, but I also understood Mark's logic. The building was huge and we only had a couple hours of daylight left. If we stayed as a group, we'd probably only see a fraction of what was here. "I guess that makes sense," I said. "But we stay in phone contact, right?" "Obviously." Mark was already heading toward what looked like a side corridor branching off to our right. "Jess, want to check out the east wing with me? There looked like there might be some interesting stuff over that way." Jess looked around the main hallway, then nodded. "Fine. But 30 minutes, and then we meet back here." Rick was already walking toward another corridor that went off to our left. "Sarah, come on. Let's see what's down this way." Sarah looked like she wanted to argue, but she followed Rick without saying anything. That left me standing alone in the main hallway as the others disappeared into their corridors, their phone lights getting dimmer until I couldn't see them anymore. The silence that came over me felt different from the quiet outside. Out there, it had just been peaceful. In here, it felt heavy, like the building itself was holding its breath. I turned on my own phone light and started walking deeper into the central section. The first room I found had clearly been some kind of office. A metal desk sat against one wall, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust and scattered papers that had been damaged beyond reading. File cabinets lined another wall, their drawers hanging open and empty. Whatever records had been stored here were long gone. I moved on to the next room, which was larger and had obviously been used for patients. 3 metal bed frames stood along the walls, their mattresses removed but the springs still visible. Medical charts were scattered across the floor, most of them water-damaged and unreadable. I picked up one that was still partially readable and could make out a patient name and some kind of medication schedule, but the handwriting was too faded to figure out completely. The walls in this room had those same dark stains I'd noticed in the hallway, and they seemed more obvious here. Some of them had patterns that looked almost deliberate, like someone had painted them there on purpose. The smell was stronger too, not just musty, but something else underneath it that reminded me of old metal left outside too long. I spent the next 20 minutes working my way through similar rooms. Patient quarters mostly, with the occasional bathroom or what might have been a consultation room. Everything was covered in the same layer of dust and decay, and every metal surface showed signs of serious rust. Some of the rooms had broken windows that let in enough natural light to see without my phone, but most were completely dark. The strangest thing was how intact everything still was. I'd expected an abandoned building to be more thoroughly stripped or vandalized, but aside from the graffiti on the outside walls, most of the interior looked like people had just walked away one day and never come back. Furniture stayed in place, papers were still scattered on surfaces, and even some personal items, a coffee mug here, a pen there, sat exactly where someone had left them. In one room, I found what looked like restraints still attached to a bed frame. The leather straps were cracked and stiff with age, but they were still buckled as if they'd been used recently. That discovery made me move a little faster through the remaining rooms. My phone buzzed with a text from Mark. Found something interesting, heading back to meet. I checked the time and realized I'd been exploring for almost exactly 30 minutes. The others would be returning to the main hallway soon, so I made my way back through the corridors I'd already covered. The return trip felt faster, probably because I knew where I was going and wasn't stopping to examine every room. When I reached the spot where we'd originally split up, Rick and Sarah were already there. Sarah looked relieved to be back with the group, and Rick seemed energized by whatever he'd seen. "Find anything good?" I asked. "Mostly just empty rooms," Rick said. "But there was this one area that looked like it might have been a kitchen or cafeteria. Still had some of the old equipment." Sarah nodded. "The whole west wing smells weird though, like chemicals or something." A few minutes later, Mark and Jess appeared from their corridor. Mark was walking faster than usual, and even in the dim light, I could see that he looked excited about something. "Okay," he said as soon as he reached us. "You guys need to see what we found." "What is it?" Sarah asked. Mark looked at Jess, who shrugged. "Tell them," she said. "There's this room down the east corridor," Mark began. "And it's not like the others. It still has equipment in it. Medical equipment, but not the normal stuff. Restraint tables, and these machines I've never seen before. But here's the weird part." He paused, clearly enjoying having our attention. "The floor is covered in this black stuff, like tar but thicker. And here's the really weird part. It looks fresh. Not like it's been sitting there for years like everything else." "Fresh how?" I asked. Jess answered. "It was still wet looking, shiny, and it didn't have any dust on it like everything else in the building." "What do you think it is?" Sarah asked. Mark grinned. "No idea, but it's definitely not normal. The whole room felt different from everywhere else we've been." "Different how?" Rick asked. "Colder," Mark said, "and the smell was really strong. Not like the rest of the building." "Maybe we should just leave it alone," Sarah suggested. "I mean, if it's some kind of chemical spill or something." "Come on," Mark said. "We drove all this way. Don't you want to see it?" He was already starting to walk back toward the east corridor. "It's just down this way. 5 minutes, and then we can head back outside if everyone wants." I found myself following him, along with the others. Mark's excitement was infectious, and I had to admit I was curious about what he'd found. A room that different from everything else we'd seen definitely warranted a look. The corridor Mark led us down was narrower than the main hallway, with doors on both sides that were all closed. Our phone lights created overlapping beams that moved across the walls as we walked, picking up more of the same peeling paint and water damage we'd seen everywhere else. "It's right up here," Mark said, stopping in front of a door that looked identical to all the others we'd passed. Mark stopped walking and turned back to face us, his phone light showing a door that looked different from all the others we'd passed. This one was heavier, made of solid metal rather than the wooden doors with small windows that lined the rest of the corridor. Faded warning signs covered its surface, biohazard symbols, radiation warnings, and text too worn to read clearly. "This is it," he said, his voice carrying that same excitement I'd been hearing all afternoon. The door had a small rectangular window at eye level, maybe 6 inches wide and 4 inches tall. Thick glass, the kind you'd expect to see in a laboratory or medical facility. Mark stepped aside so we could look through. I moved closer and looked into the room beyond. The first thing that hit me was how different it looked from everywhere else we'd explored. Medical equipment lined the walls, not the rusted, broken-down remnants we'd seen in other rooms, but machines that looked almost new. Restraint tables sat in the center of the space, their metal surfaces reflecting our phone lights. But what dominated the room was the floor. Thick, gooey pools of black substance covered nearly every inch of the concrete. It wasn't paint or tar or anything else I could immediately identify. The material had a wet, oily shine that caught the light from our phones and reflected it back in strange patterns. Some areas looked deeper than others, like puddles of varying depth, but the consistency appeared uniform throughout. "What do you think that stuff is?" Rick asked, pressing his face against the window next to mine. I didn't have an answer. The substance looked fresh, exactly like Mark and Jess had described. No dust covered its surface, no debris had fallen into it. Whatever it was, it hadn't been sitting here as long as everything else in the building. Sarah hung back from the door. "The smell," she said, covering her nose with her sleeve. She was right. Even through the sealed door, an odor leaked out that made my stomach turn. Metallic, like old pennies left in a jar, but underneath that was something rotten and organic. The combination was overwhelming. Nothing like the musty staleness we'd run into everywhere else. "We've seen it now," Jess said. "Maybe we should head back outside." But Mark was already reaching for the door handle, a heavy metal lever that looked like it belonged on a bank vault. "Come on," he said. "We drove all this way. Don't you want to get a closer look?" Something felt wrong about this whole situation, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what. The room looked too clean, too well kept compared to the rest of the building. The equipment looked like it still worked rather than being left behind. And that smell, it was getting stronger, even though the door stayed closed. "Mark, maybe Jess is right," I said. "We don't know what that stuff is. It could be dangerous." He paused with his hand on the lever and looked back at me. "It's just some old medical waste or something. Probably been sitting here since the place closed." "But you said it looked fresh," Sarah pointed out. "Fresh compared to everything else," Mark said. "That doesn't mean it's actually new." I watched him grip the lever tighter. The metal looked worn down where countless hands had touched it over the years, but the mechanism itself looked solid. Mark pulled hard, and I heard the distinct sound of heavy locks coming undone inside the door frame. The moment the door began to open, everything changed. A wind rushed out from the room that felt nothing like normal air movement. It carried that metallic smell so strongly that I gagged. But underneath the stench was something else. A pressure that seemed to push against my eardrums and make my vision blur slightly. The wind didn't feel natural. It moved with purpose, reaching past us into the corridor like invisible hands. "Mark, close it," Jess said, her voice sharp with alarm. But Mark wasn't listening. He was looking into the room with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Not excitement anymore, but something closer to confusion or surprise. The black substance on the floor was moving, not flowing like liquid, but changing and rippling as if it was alive and responding to our presence. The walls of the room seemed to bend inward at the edges of my vision. When I looked directly at them, they appeared normal, but in my peripheral vision, they curved and flexed like they were breathing. The medical equipment remained stationary, but the shadows it cast moved independently, stretching toward the open doorway. "What the hell?" Rick whispered. The door began to swing shut on its own, but Mark's arm was still extended into the room, his hand holding onto the inside edge of the frame. I saw him try to pull back, but something was stopping him from pulling his arm out. His face went from confusion to alarm to complete panic in just a few seconds. "I can't get my arm out," he said, his voice tight with effort. I moved toward him, but the sight of what was happening to his arm stopped me cold. Where his hand and forearm extended into the room, his flesh was changing color, darkening from normal skin tone to a deep gray that matched the substance on the floor. The change was spreading up his arm like an infection, but there was no pain in his expression, just confusion. The door continued to close, but Mark's body was now partially inside the room. He was being pulled inward by some force I couldn't see. When I grabbed his shoulder to help pull him back, I felt that same pressure that had come with the wind, like being slowly drawn into deep water. "Help me," Mark said, but his voice sounded different now, muffled somehow. I pulled harder, trying to drag him back into the corridor, but the force coming from inside the room was stronger than both of us. Sarah and Rick joined me, all three of us pulling on Mark while Jess pressed herself against the opposite wall, her phone light shaking as she held it. A sound came from inside the room that I'll never be able to describe properly. Part scream, part tearing metal, part something else entirely. Mark's arm, the part that had turned gray, separated from his body at the elbow. But instead of blood, the same black stuff that covered the floor poured from the wound, not dripping or spurting like blood would, but flowing in a steady stream that went against gravity. Mark looked down at where his arm used to be, and I saw his face change. The confusion was gone, replaced by complete terror. His remaining hand reached toward me as the gray color spread across his chest and down his legs. "Don't let go," he said, but his voice was barely audible now. I tried to hold on to him, but his body was becoming the same consistency as the substance on the floor. My fingers couldn't grab onto what had been solid flesh moments before. Mark was melting, his features becoming blurred as the transformation sped up. The mass that had been my best friend reached toward me one final time, and I felt myself being pulled toward the door. The same force that had taken Mark was now affecting me, drawing me into that impossible room where reality seemed to bend and break. I could feel my feet sliding across the corridor floor, my body moving forward against my will. I fought back with everything I had, using the door frame to push myself away from the opening. The pulling sensation got stronger, but I managed to break free just as the door slammed shut hard. The sound bounced through the corridor, followed by complete silence. The metallic wind stopped immediately, and the pressure in my ears disappeared. I found myself on the floor of the hallway, breathing hard and staring at the closed door. Mark was gone. I stared at the metal door, my hands still pressed against its surface where I'd been trying to hold on to Mark. The silence felt complete, like the building itself had swallowed every sound. My palms burned from where I'd scraped them against the doorframe, but I couldn't process the pain. Nothing made sense. Behind me, I heard Jess make a strangled noise that started low and built into something closer to a scream. When I turned around, she was backing away from the door, her phone light shaking so hard that the beam jumped across the walls and ceiling. "He's gone," she said, her voice breaking on the words. "Mark is gone." Rick stood frozen in place, his mouth moving but no sound coming out. Then he started repeating Mark's name, over and over, like saying it enough times would bring him back. "Mark, Mark, Mark, Mark." I pressed my face against the small window in the door, needing to see what was on the other side. The room beyond looked completely different from what we'd seen moments before. Clean concrete floors went from wall to wall. No medical equipment lined the space. No restraint tables sat in the center, and no trace of the black substance that had covered every surface remained. The room was empty. Ordinary. Nothing special about it at all. Sarah grabbed Jess's arm and started pulling her toward the corridor we'd come from. "We have to leave," she said, her voice high and tight. "We have to get out of here right now." Jess nodded and stumbled after Sarah, both of them moving faster than walking but not quite running. Their phone lights bounced ahead of them as they went back toward the main hallway. I pounded on the door with both fists, putting all my weight behind each blow. The metal barely shook under the impact. No give at all. The lever that Mark had pulled so easily wouldn't budge when I grabbed it and yanked. Locked tight, like it had never been opened. "Mark!" I shouted at the door. "Mark, can you hear me?" Nothing came back. Not even a sound. Rick's repetition of Mark's name had turned into hyperventilating. His breathing came in short, sharp gasps that bounced off the narrow hallway walls. I grabbed his shoulder and tried to get him to look at me. "Rick," I said. "Rick, we need to go." He looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. His eyes were wide and unfocused, and sweat covered his forehead, even though the air in the building was cold. "Where's Mark?" he asked. I didn't have an answer for that. Instead, I took his arm and guided him away from the door, back toward where Jess and Sarah had gone. Rick moved like he was sleepwalking, letting me steer him, but not really participating in the process of walking. The trip back through the hallways felt longer than our first time through, probably because we moved without stopping to look at anything. I kept my phone light pointed ahead, watching for obstacles while listening to Rick's rough breathing behind me. Somewhere ahead, I could hear Jess and Sarah's footsteps, faster now, almost running. When we reached the main entrance where we'd first entered the building, Jess and Sarah were already outside. I could see them through the open doorway, both of them standing in the courtyard. Jess bent over with her hands on her knees like she might throw up. Rick and I stumbled out into the late afternoon air. The sun felt too bright after the darkness inside, and I had to squint while my eyes got used to it. The normal sounds of the outside world, wind through the overgrown bushes, distant traffic from the road, seemed impossibly loud after the quiet in the building. "We have to call someone," Sarah said as soon as she saw us. "The police, or 911, or someone." Jess straightened up and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "What are we going to tell them?" she asked. "That our friend got pulled into a room by some kind of tar monster?" "We tell them the truth," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I knew how they would sound to anyone who hadn't been there. Rick walked past all of us without saying anything. He went straight for his car, moving with that same sleepwalking pace he'd kept up since leaving the hallway. When he reached his car, he got inside and started the engine without even closing the door properly. "Rick, wait," I called after him. He looked at me through the windshield, and for a second I thought he might stop. Then he put the car in reverse and backed out of the parking area so fast that gravel sprayed from under his tires. His door slammed shut as he accelerated, and within seconds he was gone, leaving only dust hanging in the air where his car had been. The three of us stood there watching the empty road where Rick had disappeared. Mark's car sat next to us, keys still in my pocket from when he'd handed them to me before we entered the building. I'd forgotten I had them until just now. "He's not coming back," Jess said. She was probably right. Rick looked like someone who'd seen something his mind couldn't process. And his solution was to put as much distance as possible between himself and this place. Sarah looked at Mark's car, then at me. "You have to drive us," she said. I nodded and got the keys from my pocket. I could still smell Mark's cologne on the keychain. Everything about this felt wrong. Driving my best friend's car without him, leaving this place without knowing what had happened to him. But we couldn't stay here. Whatever had happened in that room, it was beyond anything we could handle on our own. If Mark was somehow still alive, we needed help finding him. And if he wasn't... I couldn't finish that thought. The drive to the Danvers police station took 20 minutes, though it felt much longer. Jess sat in the passenger seat, looking out the window without speaking. Sarah curled up in the back seat, occasionally making small sounds like she was crying, but trying to keep quiet about it. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Mark's face or Rick's car following us. But the road behind us stayed empty, and Mark's seat remained vacant. The police station was a small brick building on the main street through town. I parked in front and turned off the engine, but none of us moved to get out. Sitting in the car felt safer somehow, like stepping outside would make everything that had happened real and permanent. "What do we say?" Sarah asked from the back seat. "The truth," I said again, though I still didn't know how to make it sound believable. "They're going to think we're crazy," Jess said. She was right, but we didn't have any other options. Mark was missing, and his family deserved to know what had happened to him, even if our explanation sounded impossible. Inside the station, a desk sergeant listened to our story with the kind of expression that suggested he'd heard every possible variation of teenage foolishness over the years. I tried to explain about the room, the medical equipment, the substance on the floor, and what had happened to Mark. The words sounded crazy even to me. When I finished, the sergeant asked us to repeat the story. Then he asked if we'd been drinking or using any drugs. When we said no, he asked if Mark had seemed upset or suicidal recently. When we said no to that too, he finally agreed to send someone to check it out. The response was faster than I'd expected. Within an hour, police cars and a fire truck were parked outside Danvers State Hospital. We rode back in one of the police vehicles, and I directed the officers to the area where we'd found the room. But when we got there, nothing was the same as what I remembered. The hallway I led them down had the same doors and peeling paint, but the specific door with the warning signs and the small window wasn't there. Every door we checked opened to show empty rooms with normal floors and walls. No medical equipment, no restraints, no trace of the black substance. The room I finally pointed to looked exactly like what I'd seen through the window after Mark disappeared. Clean concrete floors, bare walls, nothing special about it at all. The officers searched it carefully with flashlights, checking every corner and surface. They found dust, some old papers and water damage, but nothing that suggested anything unusual had ever happened there. "You're sure this is the right room?" one of the officers asked. I wasn't sure of anything anymore. The layout of the building looked different from what I remembered, and every room looked almost identical to every other room. Without the distinctive warning signs on the door or the small window, I couldn't tell one corridor from another. They searched the entire building. Every room, every basement area, every closet and storage space. The light from their flashlights showed decades of abandonment and decay, but nothing that matched our description of medical equipment or tar-like substances. After 3 hours, the police finished their search. The lead investigator was polite but firm when he explained that they'd found no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, and no indication that anyone had been in the building recently besides us. "Without evidence that a crime has been committed," he said, "we can't file a missing person report. Your friend is an adult, and adults have the right to leave if they want to." "But he didn't leave," I said. "Something happened to him in that room." The officer looked at me with what might have been sympathy, but his expression stayed professional. "I understand this is difficult," he said, "but we've searched the entire building. There's no room matching your description, and there's no sign your friend was ever here." We rode back to the police station in silence. Jess and Sarah sat as far from me as possible in the back of the police car, as if they blamed me for bringing them here in the first place. Maybe they were right to. If I hadn't agreed to come, if I'd supported Sarah's suggestion to stay outside, Mark would still be with us. At the station, the officers took our contact information and said they'd be in touch if anything developed. But their tone made it clear they considered the case closed. As far as they were concerned, we were a group of college kids who'd gotten spooked in an abandoned building and made up a story to cover for whatever had really happened. Walking back to Mark's car, I realized we had no missing person report, no investigation, and no way to prove that Mark had ever existed in that room. The authorities had found nothing because there was nothing to find. Whatever had happened to my best friend, it had left no trace behind, except our memories. And judging by how Jess and Sarah looked at me when I started the engine, even those were already in question. I found out about Rick on a Tuesday morning when his roommate called me. The words came through my phone in pieces that didn't make sense at first. "Found him. Yesterday evening, note on his desk." I stood in my dorm room holding the phone, watching my hand shake while Danny explained what had happened. Rick had hung himself in his bedroom. His roommate discovered the body when he came back from classes Monday night. The note was handwritten on notebook paper, 3 sentences that Danny read to me over the phone. "I'm sorry I left you guys at that place. I can't stop seeing what happened to Mark. I can't live with it anymore." The funeral was held that Friday at a small church in Rick's hometown, about an hour drive from campus. I borrowed a car from another friend and made the trip alone, arriving just as the service was starting. The church was packed with people I didn't recognize, family members, high school friends, neighbors who remembered Rick as the kid who mowed their lawns every summer. I sat in the back, listening to stories about Rick's childhood, his love for baseball, his plans to become a physical therapist. Nobody mentioned college friends or recent events. The Rick they described was cheerful, optimistic, always ready with a joke or a helping hand. Nothing about the hyperventilating, panicked person who had ran away from the hospital parking lot 2 weeks earlier. After the service, I approached Rick's parents to offer my condolences. His mother looked at me with red, swollen eyes that held no recognition until I mentioned my name. Then her expression changed completely. "You," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut. "You're one of the kids who took him to that place." Other family members turned to look at me. I felt their attention on me, their grief looking for someone to blame. Rick's father stepped closer, his face tight with anger. "My son was fine until he met your group," he said. "Whatever sick game you kids were playing, whatever you showed him, it killed him." I tried to explain that we'd been friends, that we cared about Rick, but his mother cut me off. "Get out," she said. "Get out of here, and don't come back." I left the church feeling like I'd been beaten up. The drive back to campus passed in a blur of guilt and confusion. Rick's family was wrong about us being responsible, but they weren't wrong about the timing. Rick had been fine before Danvers. Whatever he'd seen in that building had broken something inside him that couldn't be fixed. I tried calling Jess that evening, needing to talk to someone who understood what we'd all experienced. Her phone went straight to voicemail. I tried again the next day and the day after that, but she never answered. When I finally got through to her roommate, I learned that Jess had changed her number and specifically asked that I not be given the new one. Sarah proved equally unreachable. When I went to her dorm, her roommate told me she'd withdrawn from school and transferred to a college back home in Connecticut. No forwarding address, no way to contact her. Both girls had decided to cut me out of their lives completely. I spent the following weeks trying to reach them through mutual friends, social media, anyone who might have stayed in touch. The responses were always the same. Jess and Sarah needed space to process their trauma. They weren't ready to talk about what happened. They'd made it clear they didn't want contact with anyone who'd been at the hospital that day. Without any witnesses willing to back up my story, I found myself completely alone with memories that seemed increasingly unreal. I started seeing a therapist in October. 3 weeks after Rick's funeral, Dr. Martinez was recommended by the campus counseling center, and her office felt like a safe space with soft chairs and warm colors. But when she asked about the trauma I needed to process, I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. Instead, I created a story about a hiking accident. I told her that Mark had fallen from a cliff while we were exploring trails near campus, that his body had never been recovered, and that I felt guilty for not doing more to save him. The lie came easily, probably because I'd been thinking about it for weeks, as an alternative explanation that people might actually believe. Dr. Martinez listened with professional sympathy and helped me work through survivor's guilt, grief over losing a close friend, and anxiety about traumatic experiences. Her techniques were probably effective for the fictional trauma I described, but they did nothing to address the real memories that haunted my nights. Sleep became a battle I lost more often than I won. When I managed to drift off, the nightmares always found me. Dark corridors filled with the smell of old metal, wind that moved with purpose and intention, thick, black substances that reached for me with intelligent malice. I'd wake up covered in sweat, my sheets soaked, but the images never faded completely. During the day, I researched everything I could find about Danvers State Hospital. The internet provided detailed histories of the institution's 70-year operation, its role in early psychiatric treatment, and the controversial procedures performed there. I read about lobotomies, experimental drug treatments, and patient abuse scandals that had eventually led to the hospital's closure. But nothing I found mentioned supernatural occurrences or unexplained disappearances. Every account described Danvers as a tragic example of mental health care gone wrong, a place where suffering patients received inadequate treatment from overworked staff. The building's reputation for being haunted was attributed to its grim history and deteriorating condition, nothing more than urban legends created by thrill seekers and ghost hunters. I found architectural plans online and studied them obsessively, trying to locate the room where Mark had disappeared. The layout matched my general memory of the building's structure, but the specific details were frustratingly vague. Medical wings were labeled as treatment areas without describing the equipment they contained. Room numbers were listed without any indication of their specialized functions. The absence of Mark became a constant ache that colored everything I did. We'd been best friends since middle school, when he'd moved to town and ended up sitting next to me in 7th grade math class. We'd shared everything: homework struggles, dating disasters, college plans, family problems. He was the person I called when something good happened and the person I turned to when life went wrong. Now he was gone, and I had no idea if he was dead or trapped somewhere I couldn't reach. His parents had filed a missing person report after the police investigation ended, but without any leads, Ds, or evidence, the case remained open but inactive. They held a memorial service 6 weeks after his disappearance, but the absence of a body made everything feel incomplete and temporary. Mark's family asked me to speak at the memorial, and I stood in front of a room full of people who'd known him his entire life, trying to find words that honored his memory without revealing the truth about how he'd vanished. I talked about his sense of adventure, his loyalty to his friends, and his ability to make anyone laugh when they needed it most. Everything I said was true, but it felt like a betrayal to reduce his complex, vibrant personality to safe platitudes. The worst part was seeing his parents' faces during the service. They looked hollow, aged years in the span of weeks, searching for answers nobody could provide. They approached me afterward, hoping I might have some detail about Mark's final days that could offer them comfort or closure. I had nothing to give them except the same lies I told the police and the therapist. Living with the knowledge of what had really happened, while being unable to prove it or share it with anyone who mattered, created an isolation that felt complete and permanent. Mark was gone. Rick was dead. Jess and Sarah had vanished from my life as thoroughly as if they'd never existed. I was the only person left who remembered that afternoon at Danvers, the only one carrying the weight of memories that felt too strange and terrible to be real. I sat in Dr. Martinez's office on a Tuesday afternoon in late January, listening to her explain how trauma creates false memories. The radiator clicked and made noise beside her desk, while she described the mind's tendency to construct detailed stories when faced with sudden, unexplainable loss. Grief doesn't follow logic, she said, adjusting her notes in the folder marked with my name. When someone important disappears from our lives without explanation, we sometimes create stories that feel more manageable than accepting the randomness of tragedy. Her words made sense from a clinical perspective, but they did nothing to reduce the clarity of my memories. I could still smell the metallic odor that had rushed from that room, still feel the unnatural wind that had pulled Mark forward while we tried to hold him back. The texture of his skin as it changed from warm flesh to cold, gray substance stayed vivid enough that I sometimes caught myself checking my own hands for signs of discoloration. But Dr. Martinez was probably right about one thing. My isolation had become complete enough to make me question everything I thought I knew about that afternoon at Danvers. 3 months of silence from Jess and Sarah. 3 months of nightmares that left me tired and confused. 3 months of living with memories that nobody else would back up. After the session ended, I walked across campus to my dorm room and opened my laptop. The building plans for Danvers State Hospital were still bookmarked in my browser from weeks of previous research. I studied the detailed layouts of each wing, comparing them to my memories of the hallways we'd explored. The East Wing, where Mark and Jess had found their room, showed a series of patient quarters, treatment facilities, and office spaces, but nothing that matched the medical laboratory they'd described. I traced the hallways with my finger on the screen, trying to find the specific room with the warning signs and the small window. Every room was accounted for in the plans, numbered and labeled according to its original function. Patient bedrooms, group therapy spaces, hydrotherapy rooms, a pharmacy, nursing stations, all documented with exact measurements and building specifications. None of them had the heavy metal door or specialized medical equipment that had filled the room where Mark disappeared. The drive to Danvers took 40 minutes from campus, following the same route Mark had driven 3 months earlier. This time, I came prepared with proper equipment instead of relying on phone lights. 2 heavy-duty flashlights sat on the passenger seat beside a digital camera, a notepad for mapping the building's layout, and a metal detector I'd borrowed from a friend who used it for beachcombing. The abandoned hospital looked exactly the same as I remembered. Massive brick construction, broken windows, graffiti covering the lower walls. Snow covered the courtyard and clung to the bare tree branches, but the chain-link fence still had the same gaps where previous visitors had bent the metal back to create openings. I parked in the cracked asphalt area and gathered my equipment. The winter air was sharp and clean, nothing like the musty staleness that had greeted us when Mark first opened that institutional green door. Walking through the fence gap, I noticed how different the courtyard felt without the others. No excited chatter from Rick, no worried questions from Sarah, no confident leadership from Mark guiding us toward adventure. Just my footsteps crunching through patches of snow and dead leaves while I approached the same side entrance we'd used months earlier. The heavy metal door opened with the same rusty creak, releasing the same stale air that smelled like decades of abandonment. I clicked on both flashlights and stepped inside, immediately recognizing the long hallway with peeling paint strips hanging from the walls and buckled linoleum flooring. But even with powerful beams lighting up the hallway more clearly than our phone lights had managed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The layout seemed correct. Same high ceiling, same water-damaged walls, same debris scattered across the floor. But the specific details I remembered were subtly wrong. I started with the main hallway, checking every door and room systematically. Patient quarters filled with rusted bed frames and scattered papers, exactly as I'd found them during my solo exploration. Bathrooms with cracked fixtures and stained tiles. Office spaces containing empty file cabinets and water-damaged documents. Everything matched my memories of the building's general condition, but nothing felt precisely the same. The east wing presented a longer hallway lined with closed doors on both sides. I opened each one methodically, shining my lights into rooms that showed the same abandonment and decay found throughout the building. Patient bedrooms, treatment spaces, storage areas, all empty except for debris and deterioration. But the room with warning signs and the small window was nowhere to be found. I spent 4 hours searching every hallway, checking each door twice, mapping the building's layout on my notepad to compare with the building plans. The metal detector swept over floors and walls without detecting anything unusual beneath the surface. Every room contained exactly what the plans indicated it should contain, nothing more or less. When I finally gave up and drove back to campus, I felt more confused than when I'd arrived. The building was real. The hallways existed exactly where I remembered them, but the specific room where Mark had vanished seemed to have never existed at all. I returned the following weekend with a printed copy of the building plans, determined to find every numbered room and verify the building's layout against the official documentation. The process took most of Saturday afternoon, walking through each wing while checking off rooms on my list. Every space was accounted for. Every door led to a room that matched its designation on the plans. Patient quarters were patient quarters. Treatment facilities were treatment facilities. Office spaces were office spaces. Nothing had been misidentified or mislabeled in the documentation. The room with medical equipment and black substance covering the floor simply didn't exist. My third visit brought a different approach. Instead of searching randomly, I tried to recreate our exact path from that Saturday afternoon in October. I entered through the same door, walked down the main hallway to the meeting point where we'd regrouped, then followed the route Mark and Jess had taken toward the east wing. But even retracing their steps precisely, I couldn't find the room Mark had discovered. The hallway contained the same doors and the same empty spaces, but nothing matched the description of warning signs, thick glass windows, or specialized medical equipment. Each time I came back, left me more defeated and confused. The building stayed stubbornly consistent. Always the same layout, always the same rooms, always the same absence of anything unusual or supernatural. By my fifth trip to Danvers, I was forced to consider possibilities I'd been avoiding for months. Maybe Dr. Martinez was right about trauma creating false memories. Maybe the stress of losing Mark had caused some kind of shared psychotic break among our group, leading us to construct an elaborate fantasy about rooms that didn't exist and substances that couldn't be real. But that explanation fell apart when I considered Rick's suicide note. He'd written specifically about seeing what happened to Mark, about being unable to live with the memories. If our experience had been a shared delusion, Rick would have recovered from it eventually. People don't kill themselves over hallucinations that fade with time, and Jess and Sarah's behavior made no sense if nothing supernatural had happened. Changing phone numbers, transferring schools, refusing all contact. Those were the actions of people trying to escape something real and traumatic, not the responses to a group hallucination. Sitting in my car outside Danvers State Hospital for what I knew would be the final time, I watched snow begin to fall on the abandoned building. The brick walls and broken windows looked peaceful under the white coating, like any other very old structure slowly returning to nature. I'd spent weeks searching for proof that would validate my memories and confirm that Mark's disappearance had been something beyond normal human experience. Instead, I'd found only empty rooms and building plans that accounted for every square foot of the building's interior. The truth had disappeared along with Mark, leaving me with haunting memories and the unshakable certainty that something unnatural existed in that place. But certainty without evidence was just another form of delusion, and I couldn't continue chasing shadows in empty hallways. I started the engine and drove away from Danvers State Hospital, accepting that I would never find the answers I needed. Mark was gone, and whatever had taken him had erased itself so completely that even I was beginning to doubt what I'd witnessed. The building grew smaller in my rearview mirror until it vanished behind the trees, taking with it my last hope of proving that the most important day of my life had actually happened.